Hello friends, welcome to CEC Live Lectures. Dear friends, today in this session we are going to talk once again on comparative politics. Friends, we are going to specifically talk on political economy approach in comparative politics. And for the discussion on the topic, we have with us in our studios Dr. Satish Kumar Jha. Dr. Satish Kumar Jha is Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science, Aryabhatta College, University of Delhi. Dr. Jha is a prolific professor, and through him we always get in-depth knowledge on various topics and various issues. Friends, we know that you might have lots of questions while listening to the lecture. Today also, if you feel that you have certain questions to be asked, then do write to us at info.cec@nic.in, and you have privilege to talk to us live through the session. For that, you need to note down a number. Our number is 1-800-110-4380. You can definitely ask your questions live, and if you are not able to ask questions live, then you can contact us through our mail ID. In our future sessions, we are going to give answers to your questions when next time Dr. Satish Kumar Jha visits our studio. But yes, you have privilege to talk to us. Now, I would like to welcome our guest, Dr. Satish Kumar Jha, once again. Hello, sir. Welcome to the lecture.
Thank you, Geetikaji, and good afternoon. In fact, today's discussion we are going to have on this political economy approach in comparative politics. In fact, as many of us are aware, that comparative politics as a branch of political science uses different approaches to understand social and political reality, particularly the political institutions and political process. Among the approaches which are normally used in comparative politics, political economy and political sociology are the two dominant approaches which have been used by scholars, by comparativists over the years to make their argument, or to deepen the understanding of the subject. Now, out of the two approaches, in fact, political economy one can say is older than political sociology, though it is a different matter that political sociology or political sociological approach gained some ascendancy in 20th century, largely on account of behavioral revolution and other similar academic trends like system theory, structural functionalism, and many other approaches which emerge as broadly within this political sociological perspective in comparative politics. We will basically touch on this issue, that how this happened and how it affected the political economy approach in comparative politics or in social science, because political economy approach is a quite old approach so far as social science is concerned. In fact, one thing also we should remember, that there was a time when social science didn't have kind of a demarcation along disciplinary boundaries in the West, where from the social science perhaps owes its origin. In fact, most of the subjects were taught under the broad rubric called political economy. Therefore, classical thinkers, be it Adam Smith, or one can say Karl Marx, or John Stuart Mill, and one can go on naming any number of thinkers from the West. They dealt with this question of political economy, which included all those issues and questions which are today discussed under disciplinary boundaries of political science, sociology, anthropology, economics, and so on and so forth. So therefore, the birth of social science itself is a historical process, particularly the way it has happened in last 200-300 years, and therefore in fact political science and comparative politics, they also bear the mark of that parentage, or one can say the origin. But we should also remember that when this political economy was a master science, in the sense that it included different branches of social sciences, so far as the understanding of social and political reality is concerned, understanding of truth is concerned. In fact, the philosophers, and one can say that in today's parlance they can be called political economists, or one can say political scientists, all of them operated within this framework, what is today called political economy. Now, so this is something we should remember. Of course, this political economy has approach as an approach in political science, in comparative politics in particular, has of course emerged in different forms, and in fact it has never been free from the ideological baggage. And therefore, when we talk of political economy approach in comparative politics, in fact the discussion invariably gets divided between two camps, the liberalism and Marxism. Of course, within liberalism it is not a highly unified body of ideas, or one can say ideology. There are different strands within liberalism. For example, from classical political economy to neoclassical, or what is now has got basically merged with what one can say neoliberalism, and in between you have had Keynesian, post Keynesian and number of strands. So therefore, liberalism itself included different strands so far as political economy approach is concerned, and these different strands tried to use this approach in their own way by emphasizing certain aspects of in their theory, certain aspects in their analysis to understand the functioning of economic system, be it market, be it production, be it circulation, appropriation, or number of similar issues, trade, commerce. So, I mean number of issues were discussed by emphasizing certain dimensions, and therefore they were this entire liberal school was highly differentiated, particularly on issue of role which can be assigned to the state and the role which can be assigned to the market. So, the state market debate, which otherwise also is a very important theme in political economy framework, particularly any discussion of political economy, and those who basically use political economy approach, for them these two issues become very important, that what role has to be assigned to the state in the economic development of society, or in the economy management of economy of society, or what role one can give to market mechanism. And it is here that classical political economy and the entire classical school becomes important, because as Adam Smith is one of the basically pioneer in this classical political economy, who talked about hidden hands of the market, or what is also known as laissez-faireism in political theory. So therefore, this is something we should remember, that liberalism and Marxism, the two important strands, ideological strands on this issue of political economy. In fact, liberalism itself is highly differentiated, and there are multiple strands, multiple approaches within the broad liberal school, and we will be taking up all of them, and we will try to see that how different approaches differ with each other, in spite of having some unity of purpose, or unity of of mission, particularly in terms of creation of a liberal society, in order to promote this value of freedom, in order to enhance this idea of commonwealth and common good. So this is something important. In fact, lot of scholars have pointed out that the classical liberal thought, or one can say the political economy, be it Adam Smith or Ricardo or Malthus, or for that matter the political philosopher and political theorist John Locke, when they talked about capital, when they talked about labor, when they talked about surplus, when they talked about capitalism, when they talked about private property, in fact the mission was not simply the productivity, increased productivity, but they also believed in a common good, promotion of common good, and therefore that's how to protect this commonwealth, how to promote this common good of of society. So therefore that was the mission. Whereas many scholars observe that when this entire political economy approach today is used by the neoliberals, who earlier were called neoclassical also. Of course, there are certain differences, finer differences between neoclassical and neoliberal, which will look into later. In fact, this neoliberal discourse is more geared towards idea of freedom, individual freedom and choice, and therefore this common good factor is not as prominent perhaps as it was in the classical theory. of Smith, Locke and others. So, why this difference has happened? There are explanations for this also. It is believed that the classical thinkers, classical political economy emerged in after particularly aftermath of the decline of feudal order, and feudal order was characterized by collectivity. So, therefore, the idea of common good, the idea of commonwealth, idea of collectivity, and group right, not group rights, but one can say the group identity or collective identity was yet not over, particularly in societal context, and therefore, the classical political economy basically made this thing or basically used as a premise to put forth their ideas, whereas the neoliberals have been operating or have been arguing or have been churning out theories in a different context, where now capitalism is more than, one can say, that 300 years old, and therefore, what has happened that this idea of the common good in this phase of capitalism is not that prominent. What is perhaps more important is the idea of freedom, individual freedom and choice. So, that is there. Of course, there are different traditions even now, particularly if there is rational choice theory in economics, then also there is a social choice theory which talks about the common good. So, therefore, there are in fact trends even now. But the thing is that the way the classical political economy privileged this issue of common good is not present. So, therefore, that is one thing we should remember, that the ideological division between liberalism and Marxism on this political economy approach is very prominent. But within liberalism there are multiple strands. What are those strands? What are their arguments? How they use them? Particularly to understand political institutions, how they use them to understand political process, how they use them to make sense of social and political reality, and perhaps that is the purpose of comparative politics. So, therefore, this entire thing is important. Now, coming to Marxism, the another ideological strand on political economy. In fact, one thing we should remember, that Karl Marx as a thinker is believed to have done pioneer work so far as the analysis of capitalism is concerned. He in fact spent 20 years of his life analyzing and studying capitalism. Perhaps the most important contribution of Karl Marx can be rated in terms of this very incisive analysis which is offered of capitalism. Compared to other things, perhaps that was the most important thing, particularly the critique part. And therefore, in fact, one thing one should also bear in mind, that most of his writings bear this in particularly bear this prefix in the title, critique of political economy, critique of this. So, he was trying to offer a critique, and in that process he also tried to envision an utopia, that is utopia of socialism and communism. So, therefore, this analysis of capitalism was perhaps at the heart of this entire Marxian theory, the way Marx and Engels took up this job. Now, at the same time, one thing also we should remember, that Marx differed fundamentally with the classical political economists in terms of their methodology, in terms of their conclusions. In fact, of course, he drew heavily on Ricardo, in fact, but nonetheless, in fact, the differences were quite prominent, and at the same time, the methodologically, he basically used altogether different method, historical materialist approach, to understand this entire process of production and accumulation of capital. So, therefore, Marxism is another important approach which exists so far as the political economy is concerned in comparative politics. In fact, compared to liberalism, Marxism is still more unified, because at least those who have tried to enrich this entire thing, particularly in terms of offering a political economy perspective, they at least have a kind of faithful loyalty to some of the methodological tools which were basically offered by Marx. But what has happened, that in spite of that, we find that over the years, even within Marxism, there are many creative engagement with this issue, and therefore, there are many schools within in fact Marxism itself. So much so that even the rational choice, Marxism is also one important strand, in spite of the fact that rational choice the way it has emerged in political economy, particularly within liberalism, the way it talks of individual and its rational faculty and the choices which can be managed through that faculty. But nonetheless, Marxism has also at least some scholars of Marxism within Marxism have embraced it. But at the same time, the larger changes which have happened within capitalism over the years have deepened this understanding of Marxism so far as political economy approach is concerned. For example, the rise of imperialism. In fact, Marx, in spite of doing this path breaking work so far as the analysis of capitalism is concerned, did not have much to say on imperialism, and this gap was filled by Lenin, one of his ideological disciple, and therefore imperialism as the highest stage of capitalism was perhaps a very important contribution which Lenin made to fill this gap. Similarly, many other Marxist thinkers who came later, be it Rosa Luxemburg, Karl Kautsky, or one can say many other, they have also made important contributions, particularly in 20th century. The rise and emergence of this entire dependency theory, dependency school, or one can say under development theory, or known by different names, for example, world system theory of Wallenstein, those scholars who try to operationalize Marxian methodology to make sense of the larger economic reality of the world in terms of this broad capitalist system. They have also enriched this political economy approach, particularly from the perspective of Marxism. So therefore, like liberalism, Marxism has also basically progressed, or one can say had evolved in terms of a very differentiated methodological framework. Of course, ideologically they may be more homogeneous compared to liberalism, but methodologically one can say that there has been some differentiation within this school. So therefore, when we talk of political economy approach in comparative politics, we have to bear in mind these two traditions, that is liberalism and Marxism. But before we take up these two traditions, that is liberalism and Marxism, so far the political economy approach is concerned, we have to turn our attention to one issue, that 20th century, at least the beginning of the 20th century, or at least after the Second World War, in comparative politics and political science, political economy was highly marginalized. And it was the period when we could see the ascendancy of political sociological approach, not the political economy approach. How this happened? Why this marginalization had taken place? One thing we should remember, that the post Second World War period was a period of reconstruction and re-engagement with many issues. In fact, in economics itself, it was a period of basically a shift from the classical political economy of laissez-faireism to the Keynesian era, when basically Keynes argued about the state intervention in economy, particularly aftermath of the Great Depression of 30s, when entire capitalism was under deep crisis and was basically on the point of destruction. And at that time many people thought that Marx's prognosis, or one can say the prediction, that there is an inherent tendency in capitalism for its destruction was coming true, and it was that around that time that Keynes emerged as a great messiah of capitalism and shaped it by simply arguing for state intervention in economy to generate demands. So from supply side the focus shifted to demand side, and this is how perhaps capitalism could save itself. And it is this context that New Deal policy of Roosevelt, United States of America, is often remembered, that how he implemented some of the prescriptions of Keynes, and how this entire major shift in paradigm took place in political economy. In spite of that, what we find that the Second World War, the post Second World War, so far as comparative politics is concerned, was marked by a number of shifts and transformations in approaches. And one major transformation, or one can say major shift, was in terms of the popularity of structural functionalism and system theory, particularly drawing on this behavioral revolution in social science, which started in psychology and then from anthropology and sociology moved to political science. And along with this, what we find that some of the pioneers of sociology and anthropology, some of the great traditions of political theorization of theorizations and thinking in sociology and anthropology came directly to influence comparative politics and political science. And here one can refer Max Weber, Talcott Parsons, and of course also before Parsons one can refer Malinowski, and Radcliffe Brown, Merton, and all these pioneers in sociology and anthropology who had contributed significantly for the rise of this structural functionalism, who had contributed significantly for enriching and deepening this entire political sociological approach, became very important and prominent in comparative politics. So therefore, the focus was now, or basically the focus of a study in comparative politics at that time and in political science also was issues which were sociological in nature, and of course the economy became a peripheral concern. So therefore, what happened? Political socialization, political communication, recruitment, and many other issues, political culture, these were perhaps these words became the buzzwords of comparative politics and political science. Political scientists, basically turned their entire, attention on these issues. They didn't consider the economic aspect of society as important as these aspects. Of course, when they talked of system, they also talked of various subsystems of this political system as a subsystem of societal system. Society as a system, when they analyzed and explained, they also argued that this society as a system as a whole has many subsystems, and politics is one subsystem, economy is another subsystem. But as a political scientist, as a comparative political scholar, political analyst, they thought that their job was to study political subsystem more than perhaps other subsystems, and therefore this disciplinary, on the one hand they talked of interdisciplinary nature of reality, but on the other hand they also basically operated strictly within disciplinary boundaries. So this is how we find that 50s and 60s were the period when this entire behavioral revolution and structural functionalism, system theory, they were the dominant modes of analysis in comparative politics, not political economy. And of course, that was also the period, interestingly, when a lot of churning was happening in different societies so far as the management of economy is concerned. On the one hand, there was a shift in the West from the classical to the Keynesian. On the other hand, we have had the Soviet model of economic development, and at the same time the Japan and many third world countries. So in this context, it becomes very interesting that how this happened, how this ascendancy of political sociology at the cost of political economy happened. We will be basically discussing this issue, shortly.
With this note, thank you so much for giving us this session. Friends, you are requested to be with us as we are going to be back after a short break, and we are going to continue this topic further. Thank you. Hello friends, welcome back to this session. Friends, as you know that today we are talking on political economy approach in comparative politics, and for the discussion on the topic we have with us in our studios Dr. Satish Kumar Jha. Dr. Satish Kumar Jha is a associate professor and he's teaching in Department of Political Science, Aryabhatta College, University of Delhi. Friends, if you wish to ask questions from Dr. Jha on today's topic, that is political economy approach in comparative politics, then you can contact us through our toll-free number. Our number is 1-800-110-430. I repeat, our number is 1-800-110-430. Now, I would like to welcome our guest, Dr. Jha, once again. Hello, sir. Welcome to the lecture.
Thank you, Geetika ji. And what in fact we were discussing before this break was that how in 20th century, political sociology in fact became a dominant discourse in comparative politics and political science. And as a result of this, what happened, that political economy, which was a very old approach to understand social and political reality, got marginalized. What was the reason for that? What was the reason for this marginalization? And in that context, I was telling you that how political science and comparative politics were basically under a spell of behavioral revolution, system theory and structural functionalism. And these three important strands of thought, or one can say this entire academic trend, or one can say academic revolution, got influenced by many sociologists and anthropologists. And the most important person who can be cited here was Max Weber, the great German sociologist. In fact, Max Weber is considered to be one of the pioneers so far as sociology is concerned, and as a thinker whose importance is as important in perhaps in political science as in other branches of social sciences. In fact, a person who was a sociologist, but nonetheless he also wrote a book, Economy and Society. So his understanding of many aspects of societal process were so powerful and so important that even today, in order to have a very comprehensive understanding of social reality, one keeps referring to Weber's ideas and Weber's thought, be it the question of his authority system or his analysis of the transition from feudalism to capitalism, particularly his famous book Protestant Ethics and a Spirit of Capitalism. So therefore, the Weber's imprint on social science was there, but particularly when this entire structural, functional and system theory emerged, in fact they drew heavily on Weber, particularly from the point of view of the importance which Weber attached to collective action, social action. Therefore, he is also known as the pioneer in social action theorist, which later on got associated with Parsons and other. So therefore, Weber was one. But another important person, thinker, a sociologist, who became important for this system theory, structural functionalism, was Talcott Parsons, particularly his pattern variables, the way this system theory tried to differentiate between two systems or two societies, traditional societies and modern societies, particularly the process of modernization, because this entire approach was also called modernization theory, because what happened that they were trying to look at the question of the process of transition in newly independent nations of the world, in Asia, Africa and Latin America. This is what is often called as third world countries or developing countries, because that was the challenge. Because what happened that most of these scholars who were using this approach, political sociology approach at that time, through this structural functionalism, system theory and similar other approaches, their main concern was to explain the trajectory of development in these newly independent nations of Asia, Africa and Latin America, what path they should follow, what mission they should set for themselves, and in this process they try to construct an ideal type for them, this drawing on the ideas of Max Weber so far as the ideal type is concerned. And they set the ideal type in terms of the differentiation of structure, in terms of larger pattern variables from affective to affective neutrality and many other things. So therefore, what they try to convey that these countries can emulate the same path through which the Western nations have achieved this development, and therefore they talked about development syndrome, equality, differentiation, and many other features of this development syndrome at Sydney, Barwa and others, Lucian Pai and others basically try to explain. So, this is how this entire modernization theory, or one can say development school, came into existence, where they were drawing heavily on the ideas of Weber, Parsons, Radcliffe Brown, Malinowski, and in political science through David Easton and Almond, these approaches and these tools and techniques of analysis became important, and this is how this political sociology approach became a very powerful approach or perspective in comparative politics. And we find that around that time within liberal tradition there were very few people who were using political economy. Of course, Marxist scholars continued to use political economy approach, particularly from Marxian point of view, but within liberal tradition most of them were more comfortable with this political sociology approach. But this did not last long. By 60s we find that within this entire group of scholars who were called system theorists, or one can say structural functionalists, some sort of discomfort surfaced. In fact, some sort of dissatisfaction happened, and therefore the famous speech of David Easton, where he talked about credo of relevance, and also heralded a new revolution which was called post behavioral revolution in political science, and therefore some of the premises on which they were working, in fact they questioned them and say that they were not enough. So therefore within this structural functionalists this sort of development happened, but then there are other issues which were also happening. What happened, as I mentioned, that the ascendancy of this political sociology approach at the cost of political economy was largely on account of the fact that they were trying to explain development in newly independent nations. But what happened, that these scholars were mostly located in United States and its universities, they failed to explain some of the developments which started taking place by late 60s. Particularly one can refer here the students' unrest in France, Vietnam problem, the OPEC crisis, and stagflation in United States of America, and many other things. So after 20-30 years of economic boom, all on a sudden there was some lull, and was basically the American economy, and thereby the global economy started facing some problem. So the Keynesian discourse, which basically rescued capitalism after Second World War, itself came under some fire, and therefore this was the period when we find that again political scientists also who were simply ignoring the issue of the economic variables of politics, they suddenly became aware and sensitive about the new challenges, and this is how we find that along with this realization of the limitation of political sociological approach as channeled through structural functionalism, system theory and behavioralism, these developments also basically made them aware about the limitation of such a very closed perspective, where they had turned where they had closed their eyes toward the economic aspect of society, or one can say the economic developments, or one can say the political economy perspective altogether. So this is in this context we find that after this initial marginalization, political economy again resurfaced in a big way, and it was a period when, of course, within Marxism a very powerful intellectual movement started in name of dependency theory, and one can say the world system theory, particularly in Latin America. Of course, started by not the Marxists, but by some liberals like Rohr, Prebisch and other, but later on it was picked up, the thread was picked up by the neo-Marxists who were also called neo-Marxists like Andre Gunde Frank, Wallenstein, Shamir Amin, Ranjit Sahu and all of them. So they were trying to question some of the premises of this development theory, which was being presented by this structural functionalist and system theory in comparative politics. They started turning this entire table on them by saying that what they say, development is not development, but it is a development of underdevelopment. These countries are getting more underdeveloped, they are falling in debt trap, and it was around that time that we find that many African countries were really basically falling in debt trap. Debt trap problem was becoming very prominent. In fact, some of the Bretton Woods institutions like IMF and World Bank, which emerged after the Second World War along with United Nations to basically stabilize and create a larger framework of world peace, world trade and governance. What happened that IMF, which at one point what time was basically created in order to stabilize exchange rate, by 60s what happened, from gold it moved to dollar, became the anchor of exchange rate, and it was around that time from fixed it became totally changing exchange rate, and therefore number of issues came up, and it was around this time that when these African countries were facing their problem, a whole set of prescriptions were offered by IMF and similar other Bretton Woods institutions. One of them was a structural adjustment program, and this structural adjustment program included liberalization, management of fiscal deficit, privatization and many other similar measures in order to tide over the crisis, and therefore these issues were becoming very prominent. So, on the one hand we find that realization about the limitation of political sociological approach, on the other hand the new challenges which were emerging in the world, and these political scientists, particularly the comparative politics scholars, suddenly realized that the kind of approach they were using was not enough to explain these challenges, and therefore they had to take into account certain other variables, they had to take into account certain other perspectives, and it was in this context that we find the revival of political economy approach happens in comparative politics by 60s. And one thing we should also remember, particularly late 60s and 70s, and at the same time we should also remember that this political economy approach from the very beginning has been struggling with this issue, that is state market debate, so far as the economic development is concerned. At that time, particularly since the days of the classical political economy, what has happened that even the classical political economists like Adam Smith, Ricardo, Malthus, or one can say that the political classical thinkers, liberal thinkers like Locke and others, they always believed in free enterprises, they always believed in free trade, they always believed in minimal state intervention, or one can say a limited state, and therefore this discourse was prominent that economic enterprises should be promoted unhindered by any political interference. But what happened that suddenly late 70s and 80s it was realized that on the one hand these crises were gripping the world, and therefore they had to change the gear, and it was in this context that after this after this economic boom, when there was a simmering discontent, or one can say that there was a lull in the Western world, particularly in the capitalist economies or the developed economies, and there was a kind of resentment and dissatisfaction with the Keynesian theory, we find that a new right discourse started surfacing, and this new right discourse was basically spearheaded by some important political theorists, political economists like Hayek, Friedman and many others, particularly they were also called the proponents of, or one can say the protagonists of the Chicago school. So what happened, this new right theory emerged as a kind of perspective which questioned this entire method of managing economy, the way it was being done under a spell of Keynesianism, and they said that no, the free enterprises, that the market mechanism, free trade, global trade and other things should be promoted and celebrated, and therefore a state should simply keeps its hands off from the economic affairs of the society. And the two important leaders in the West, particularly Reagan in United States of America and Thatcher in Britain, they were advised by these two advisors, because the Friedman was advisor of Reagan and Hayek was advisor of Thatcher, and their policies also became famous as Thatcherism and Reaganomics. This was a new trend in political economy, particularly within liberal tradition, the rise of the neo-right. And it is interesting to see that this neo-right later on became the neoliberalism. Today, in fact, we call them neoliberals or neoliberalism. Some of the arguments which were being promoted by these neo-right thinkers later on got merged with this neoliberal discourse. And here it is also important to remember that this neoliberalism is basically the legatee of, or one can say that carrying forward the tradition of neoclassical economics, but of course with some finer distinctions. So, what are those distinctions are also important to remember, but it is in this context that we find that the political economy approach has made a powerful comeback in comparative politics within both liberalism and Marxism. Marxist scholars from the very beginning were concerned with the political economy approach, because Marxism always believes in a kind of base superstructure analysis of social formation, where the base, that is the economic structure, is the foundation for politics for other spheres of society. So, therefore, in their analysis economy always plays important role, to the extent that many critics point out that there is economic reductionism in Marxism, because they simply ignore and marginalize other factors for economic explanation. But nonetheless, one thing is important, that this entire historical materialist approach which they use is heavily dependent on this political economy approach or political economy as a vantage point. So, therefore, within Marxism this was there, but within liberalism this marginalization remained short lived, and we find that again there is a bouncing back of this political economy approach in the big way. So, therefore, this is something important to remember, but at the same time what I was trying to mention earlier, that this state market relationship and this debate which is as old as political economy, that which one should play more important role in political in the management of economy, state or market. And the classical political economists settled for market, free enterprises, as Adam Smith his famous book Wealth of Nations talked about hidden hands of the market, what in political theory is called laissez-faireism. In fact, later on faced a kind of puzzle and dilemma, because it was realized that some of the Asian countries where the state was playing a very important role in development, particularly Japan and in 20th century, and of course later on in 80s, late 70s and 80s, some of the Asian countries like Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea, which are often referred as Asian tigers. So, there also the state, of course, authoritarian state facilitating economic development. So, it was altogether different model. In fact, after the Second World War, one can say that the three important models which existed so far as the development is concerned, economic development is concerned, and for political economy, economic development is an important reference point. One was the market oriented, second was the state oriented development, particularly the kind of ideological frame which was provided by socialism in Soviet Union and its satellite countries. And the third was many countries who neither purely operated within the market frame or purely within the state frame like Soviet Union and China, rather they basically, it was billed as the mixed economy, where they tried to harmonize and combine the two things, including India. Particularly the way it talked about import substitution, demanded new international economic order, talked of self-reliance, and through democratic path they wanted to bring development to the society and to the people. So, this was basically the three important trajectories. So far as the after Second World War is concerned, this entire discourse on economic development was taking place. But what happened later, after this market oriented and discourse had to face some crisis, particularly as I mentioned the OPEC crisis, stagflation and other things in the West, and that necessitated a search for a new paradigm, and it was in this context that this neo-right discourse emerged, which tried to revive the old laissez-faireism or the classical political economy in the new context, and therefore many people call it neoclassical, not purely classical, because this was basically trying to give some selective role to the state, unlike the classical, which was simply in a mood to banish the state from these developments. So it is in this context that we find that this entire political economy approach on the one hand witnessed revival, on the other hand we also find that it generated new interest and new issues, it brought new issues on the agenda of comparative politics. Now it is in this context that we have to see that what is political economy, by the way. Now one thing is important, that it is a combination of two things, the politics and economy, and of course which one should be given more importance, this is also a matter of debate, whether the politics part is more important or the economy part. But one thing is very important, that it is normally defined as a framework within which a state deals with economic questions and interdependence of politics and economics, and therefore it is called political economy. In fact, Joseph Schumpeter in 1954, in fact in his book History of Economic Analysis, he basically defined it nicely. He said that the political economy is exposition of comprehensive set of economic policies on a strength of certain unifying normative principles such as liberalism and socialism. So therefore Schumpeter Schumpeter tries to explain it in this way, that it is a basically comprehensive set of economic policies on the strength of certain unifying normative principles. Of course within normative principles he brings liberalism and socialism. So therefore there are different ways to look at it, but one thing is very important, that this approach, political economy approach, tries to look at the two variables of society, the politics and economy, in a more balanced manner, that how they basically determine each other, how they are interrelated with each other, and together how they shape the future of society, how the people's lives are determined and shaped. Because one thing is very important, that the political economy as an approach may be modern, particularly its discussion starts with the classical theory, but one thing we should remember, that since the time the people started becoming started producing, since the time when it became from hunter gatherer it became a producer. In fact this entire enterprise called political economy came into existence. It is of course considered to be a modern enterprise, but nonetheless we should not forget that even ancient thinkers, be it Kautilya in India, who basically called his treatise as Arthashastra, and Arthashastra basically is nothing but gets translated as economics. It is a different matter that Kautilya's Arthashastra has a very powerful take on administration and on government. Similarly in Greek thinkers like Aristotle in particular, the way he talked about many variables of political economy, the way he talked about cities divided on line of classes. So therefore these issues have been there earlier also, may not be in this form, the way perhaps the modern capitalism offers challenges, and perhaps the way the modern thinkers engage with this issue, starting with the classical political economy. But nonetheless, invention of agriculture, and from hunter gatherer to settler, invention of agriculture, generation of surplus, and from barter system when the money was invented, and with the rise of cities, with the birth of merchant class and the market, all these things facilitated the growth of this understanding, and this understanding which later on became more sophisticated and got organized in name of political economy. So therefore this political economy in fact as an approach should be understood as a perspective which basically gives importance to the two variables, that is the politics and economy. Now, William Petty, his time period is from 1623 to 87. In fact, he at times is referred as the father of political economy, because he is one who said that government expenditure and administration both need a thorough analysis. He advocated the free rein to different forms of individual self interest, and therefore many people feel that he was a precursor of laissez-faire theory, which became prominent later, particularly Adam Smith and others. Now, it is in this context that we have to remember this Scottish Enlightenment and its contribution so far as the rise of political economy is concerned, be it Hume, be it Adam Smith or others. This Scottish Enlightenment has played very important role in the birth of this political economy approach, and comparative politics has been drawing on their ideas in a big way. In fact, what happened that by from 1740 to 90, this is the time period when normally people believe that political economy as a moral philosophy got consolidated, because we must remember that initially those thinkers who were dealing with this political economy were also moral philosophers. They were looking at these questions from ethical and moral point of view, because as I mentioned in the very beginning that there was no such differentiation as it exists today among various branches of social sciences. In fact, there was a time when politics, economy, culture, religion, philosophy, all these knowledge systems were fused together, and moral philosophy of course was the overarching framework under which they were trying to deal with. And therefore, as I mentioned that the classical political economists, when they prioritize the issue of common good, unlike the today's neoliberals who are prioritizing freedom for a different context, and I also explained the reason that how the classical political economists were arguing in a context where feudalism had ended and capitalism had taken place, and therefore this collectivity, the collective identity of feudalism was not a distant reality, or one can say a distant past, whereas for the neoliberals of today it is a distant past, and therefore this common good argument holds no importance for them, and they are more concerned with freedom. So what happened is Scottish Enlightenment I was referring to, 1740 to 90 is a period when this moral philosophy got consolidated. Now, Scotland is a very interesting geographical area in Europe. In fact, now it is part of England, the United Kingdom. As you must be knowing that at times it is becoming a federal arrangement, where Scotland sometimes tries to get separated, sometimes they are part of it. But from the very beginning, this issue has been slightly problematic for United Kingdom. Now, initially Scotland was allied to France, but and England was its enemy. But only in 1707 that this union took place between Scotland and England. So, in fact, Scottish thinkers from the very beginning were worried about the future of poor, backward Scottish economy. So, therefore, what happened that on the one hand they were sandwiched between the prosperous England and on the other hand impoverished Ireland. And French Enlightenment, because they were a part of the France earlier as I mentioned, French Enlightenment and its focus and emphasis on region had influenced them considerably, but only difference was that the French Enlightenment was wider in its sweep, whereas the Scottish Enlightenment was more geared towards political economy. And hence it is not surprising that from Hume to Adam Smith, all of them were basically the protagonists of this discourse. So, this is how we have to see the beginning of political economy, but then there are many other issues which we have to take up in this discussion, which will be basically covered in the next part of our lecture, that will be the part 2.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for giving us this productive session. Friends, you are requested to write to us at info.cec@nic.in if you have any question left, and if you want your question to be answered, then you can contact us at the same ID, and we will try to give answers to your questions when next time Dr. Satish Kumar Jha visits our studio. So keep watching us, keep writing us. We are going to meet again soon, and we would be continuing further. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you, sir. Thank you once again.